are that you've probably seen a drama like that in the past, where you've seen the character of the innkeeper being played out, and the innkeeper eventually has to say to Joseph and Mary that there is no room in the inn, right? These very strong words saying, sorry, we're all filled up, there's no place for you here. And so we often get a little bit angry at the innkeeper when we think about, well, doesn't he recognize that Joseph and Mary are just finished traveling all the way from Nazareth to Bethlehem, which is a 70-mile trip. It's not an easy trip to make in those days. Probably took them several days to make it. And couldn't he see that Mary was great with child? And we kind of create the scenario in our mind. We imagine that, it was late at night that they arrived, and it was cold, and it was rainy, and Mary is just about ready to pop, and this innkeeper says, sorry, there's no room in the inn. And we get kind of angry at this innkeeper. And sometimes, well, maybe you think to yourself, well, the innkeeper, at least he had the foresight to say, well, you can go to a stable out back, and maybe, I know it's not ideal, but hey, I can't do anything about the fact that we're all filled up. At least you can go to the stable and have that as a place for you to give birth. Regardless of how you think about the innkeeper, probably throughout the ages, there really has been a strong reaction. And we think about how inconsiderate he must have been, and how terrible it must have been for Joseph and Mary to deal with the situation. And that's why we have these songs that we sing. The song that we just sang now, Prepare Him Room, comes out of that story. Or the other one that we've sung as hymns, Come into my heart, Lord Jesus, there is room in my heart for thee. And so we have this language that we use because there was no room in the inn for Joseph and Mary. And so without a doubt, the preaching that has happened throughout history has been harshly used against the innkeeper. Martin Luther writes this, and he's a famous reformer in the 16th century, and one of his famous sermons on Christmas, he writes this. He says, and he not only slams the innkeeper, he slams all of the people in Bethlehem. He says, shame on you, wretched Bethlehem. That inn should have been fired with brimstone, for while thieves and cutthroats lounged and caroused in the inn, Mary and Joseph were refused a place and were sent to the stable. But I want to ask a question. What do we actually know about the innkeeper? What do we actually know about the details of that day when Jesus was born? Probably the best thing to do is actually go to the scriptures and see actually what it says. Because a question that I have is, have we embellished this story a little bit too much? Have we let our imaginations run wild a little bit according to this story? So the only place that we have this is in Luke chapter 2. So let's look at what it says in Luke 2. It says, in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. Now this is coming from the New International Version. It doesn't actually even use the word inn. It has nothing to do with the innkeeper. We have no recording at all of the innkeeper making any comments towards Mary and Joseph. And when we read this story, it might come as a surprise to you that this is all the details that we have. In fact, well, we have more details, of course, of the angels and about the shepherds and about the wise men and the escape into Egypt. But these are the only details. We have less than 30 verses in the New Testament that are actually referencing the birth of Jesus. So what do we know about his birth? Well, we know, of course, that he was born in Bethlehem. That's very clear in Scripture. There is a prophecy, many prophecies that are throughout the ages that have told us that he was going to be born in Bethlehem in the city of David. We also know that Herod, we talked about last week, who was very incensed that this king of the Jews was born in Bethlehem, and so he wiped out all of the babies 2 years old and under, all the male children. And so we know that that was part of the process of him trying to wipe Jesus off the face of this earth. We also know that the census is what brought Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem. Joseph was a descendant of King David, and Bethlehem was the ancestral home of David. And so Joseph brings Mary with him from Nazareth all the way to Bethlehem. And we know that this place would have been fuller than normal as other people were traveling to that home as well. There is no indication that Joseph and Mary arrived just in time for her to give birth, as we sometimes imagine. In fact, it's highly unlikely that Joseph and Mary would travel while she was in her 9th month of pregnancy. This is a long and difficult journey from Nazareth. In fact, verse 6 says, while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. So more than likely, they had already been in Bethlehem for a while before Jesus was born. But the most curious part of this story is that there's no mention of an innkeeper at all. There is no mention of the innkeeper telling Joseph and Mary that, I'm sorry, there's no room in this inn. The reason why we have imagined that scenario over and over again is because most English translations have used the word inn to describe a Greek word that's in the text. And I'm going to tell you what that Greek word is. It's kataluma. And that Greek word has often been translated as an inn. And as soon as we hear that word, we're often thinking about a modern-day motel that has many different rooms with clean beds, and that's the kind of scenario that we imagine. And of course, all these rooms are filled up, and the concierge comes up and says, sorry, there's no room in the motel for you. But this would be a mistake for us to insert and impose our modern Western culture mindset onto the text. Luke actually uses this word, this Greek word called kataluma. He uses it a second time in chapter 22, and he does this in reference to Jesus when he's talking about the Last Supper, the Passover meal with his disciples. And this is what it says in Luke 22. He says to his disciples, as soon as you enter Jerusalem, a man carrying a pitcher of water will meet you. Follow him. At the house he enters, say to the owner, the teacher asks, where is the guest room? Where is the kataluma? Where I can eat the Passover meal with my disciples. He will take you upstairs to a large room that is already set up. That is where you should prepare your meal. They went off to the city and found everything just as Jesus had said, and they prepared the Passover meal there. So this is a scenario that we are more familiar with, that we are more ready to accept, and we talk about the place where Jesus had the Passover as the upper room, because it was in the upstairs. It was a guest room. It was a place of lodging, temporary lodging, a place to rest, a place to have a meeting space. And so that's why Luke and the NIV actually translates that word as a guest room, both in chapter 2 and also chapter 22. Now, if this doesn't sound convincing to you, I want you to know that there is a perfectly legitimate Greek word that would describe more of what we're thinking about when we talk about a hotel or motel. And Luke actually uses that in chapter 10 when he's telling the story about the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan is the story where he comes across a man who is badly beaten. He brings the man onto his donkey, brings him to an inn. And this is what it says. It says that he took him to an inn. This is Luke chapter 10. And that Greek word, pandocheon, is where he took care of him. The next day he ended the innkeeper. Again, another Greek word based upon the same one as the inn. He gave him 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I will pay you the next time I'm here. So here we have Luke, Dr. Luke, who's choosing his words very carefully. He's using a different Greek word here to describe an inn, or something more similar to what we think of when we think of a Motel 6, that he's bringing him to this motel. Please look after him, pays the owner to look after this man. And so Luke did not use this Greek word when he describes where Joseph and Mary are coming to. Because Joseph is coming to Bethlehem, his ancestral home. It is more likely that he came into contact with his relatives that were already living there. And by all likelihood, he stayed with them as he was in Bethlehem. And because of the large influx of people that had come to Bethlehem at that time, there was no room in the kataluma, no room in the guest room. And the guest room most likely was upstairs. That's the place where they would dress, where they would sleep, where they would wash themselves, and it was full of people, and there was no place for a pregnant woman. And so Joseph and Mary went to the lower level of the house, because it's hard to imagine that Joseph's family would reject Mary and Joseph, especially in a society that greatly values hospitality. So it is more than likely that Joseph and Mary were placed in the lower level of the house. Well, what about the manger? What about the animals that we sing about? Well, the Bible actually doesn't talk about animals, but it does talk about a manger, and a manger is a feeding trough for animals. And a manger, I'm going to show you a picture in a minute, but that manger in the first century was often made out of rock, out of stone. They would dig out a space so that was where they would put the food and the grain for the animals. Archaeologists have excavated first century homes, and this is what they've discovered. That the floor and the upstairs is really the guest chamber, and the lower level is the living area or the dining area, and also a place for animals to come to stay, especially the young or valuable, to prevent them from being stolen, and also as a place to bring heat into the home. This was another source of heat for them. And if that seems strange to you, I can tell you that I've had similar conversations with my wife about the need to have animals in our house. When we got our dog, and it's a Shetland, we call it a Sheltie, it's a Shetland sheepdog and has lots and lots of hair on it. And I suggested to her that this dog is used to being in the highlands and where it's cold. And I'm sure it can stand outside 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year. And to which she responded, maybe you'll be more comfortable out there too. So I lost that argument, and we now have animals in our house, not only on the lower level, but on the upper level too. And so this is where the manger comes into play. Mary likely gave birth to Jesus in the lower level of this crowded house, in which some of the animals were invited to be brought in for the night, because it says that she wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger. And this is a scene, a picture of a manger that I took when I was in Israel. Well, I think it's helpful for us to have a clearer picture of the events of Jesus' birth. And I think it's also very helpful that we don't read into the text our own modern Western culture view and impose that upon what we are reading. But truthfully, what's even more important is to never become so focused on the peripheral details of the story that we miss out on the big point of what is actually occurring. The big point, of course, is the fact that Jesus Christ entered into our world as a human baby. He entered into our world in the flesh. He revealed himself as the Son of God. And not only that, he died on the cross for our sins so that we can have a relationship with him. It was the greatest gift that could possibly be given. He was born to die. Even though we have mistakenly accused the innkeeper for not making room for Jesus, we are still prone to doing that in our own lives. In fact, I think one of the reasons why we have been so quick to import the story of the innkeeper into the story of the birth of Christ is because we can relate to it. We can relate to this story about, I'm sorry, Jesus, I have no room for you. My life is already so busy that I can't add any more things. I don't have time to work on my spiritual life. It seems like a chore to actually spend the energy and the effort that is required to include Jesus into my life. Or, as the innkeepers in the skit that we just saw, what's the value? What's the benefit? What's in it for me? And we don't make room for Jesus. From the very beginning of Jesus' life and entry into this world, Jesus was always sidelined. He was always pushed to the side. He was crowded out. In fact, as a baby, as a young child, he was a refugee as his parents had to flee to Egypt or face certain death. And so all along, Jesus has been pushed aside, he's been abandoned, he's been mistreated. And yet, look at how Jesus responds to us. Think about how he opens his arms wide for all of us. Even though we have mistreated him, even though we have abused him, even though we have crowded him out in our lives, Jesus opens his arms wide to each one of us. And he invites us into a relationship. He is the one with the greatest gift of hospitality. He is the best host you can possibly imagine. And the guest room is never overcrowded for you and I. And this is what it says in John 14. He says, "Don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust also in me. There is more than enough room in my Father's house. If this were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? When everything is ready, I will come and get you, so that you will always be with me where I am." That is the gift that Jesus has offered to us. Even though we crowd him out, even though we push him aside, we sideline Jesus in so many ways, he has opened up his arms wide and he says, "Please come. I've prepared a room for you." And so we're going to be hearing two testimonies this morning. And if you listen carefully to their stories, you will hear that they have, in their life, they have crowded Jesus out. They have sidelined him. And they decided to go their own route, their own way. And they found that leads nowhere. It doesn't lead to a happy place. And then they came to the place in their life where they were overwhelmed by the hospitality of God, who invited them in. They surrendered their life to him. And now they are enjoying a beautiful relationship with Jesus. And so I'm going to invite Louise first to come up, and then Sean will come afterwards. And they're going to share their story with you and then get baptized.